Hi everybody. This week we are focusing on political violence. And this is an important part of political action, but we have to try and understand exactly where it comes from, when is it more likely to happen, and what if at all, therefore, we can do to minimize those events of political violence, assuming that we believe this is not something good. So when we define political violence, it's very simply talking about a political action, a violent political action, or a violent action that is carried out by people or by governments, but it has to have political goals. And there is a whole range of such events and actions that would fit in this definition of political violence. Violence with political motivation. And it can also be carried, and this is important to remember, by states, by governments, or by non-states, from anywhere from individuals to groups and organizations. So you can think about a range of violence with political motivation that includes anything and everything, such as guerrilla warfare, insurgency armed groups, terrorism, domestic and international, a rebellion movement, violent protests, rioting, a revolution, civil war, genocide, ethnic cleansing, police brutality, and even war between nation states. These are all examples and illustrations of this idea of political violence. We tend to think about, when it comes to political behavior and political participation, we tend to think about the relationship between states and non-state actors, either organized, such as a terror group or an insurgency group, or less organized, such as a violent protest and riots. Those are examples of non-state actors trying to address political goals with the state through the use of violence. And of course, there are examples of non-state actors trying to influence other non-state actors. And there are examples where governments try to impact or influence or coerce non-state actors using violence as well. So why does that happen? And especially, we can think about why that the system no longer serves them, and the only way to bring up change is through the use of violence. And we can think about a variety of push and pull factors. There are some factors, some motivations that push you towards violence. Those usually come from the grievance side of the equation. Anything from frustration, deep frustration with the government or other groups' action, the feeling of isolation and exclusion, and this idea of a relative deprivation. Relative deprivation is very important here, and it is different than just deprivation more in general, in that in relative deprivation, there is no objective measure. In other words, a person would not feel that they are deprived of something until they see that others have it, right? So we may be very, very happy with our Toyota until we move into a neighborhood where everybody are riding a Mercedes. This is, of course, kind of a very simplistic example, but that is the idea behind relative deprivation. So all of those things are arguably push factors. So if you experience this deep level of grievance and disappointment and frustration, you might then be pushed and decide to use violence. The other side of the equation are pull factors, and they could be understood as greed. Sometimes there are actual monetary payments, or access to diamonds in some civil war examples, etc. But in other times, it's a search for something else. So the pull is for this idea behind political violence that has it as an adventure, or becoming a hero, getting the respect of others, being part of the movement. So those are all our pull factors. Right? Now, we also know from research that whenever there is some sort of unrest, civil unrest, and there is a violent enforcement, such as police brutality or using force on what would otherwise be considered a peaceful demonstration, we know that entices people to then take up arms and use violence as well. And we also know that there is more violence when we look up to the government, to state institutions, the government, the police, the courts, when we don't think that they are capable or want to address and solve the problems of the society. And so it's this idea that the system failed me, and the only way to now get anything changed or anything moved or improved is using violence. Now, a lot of political violence nowadays is organized. You think about terror groups, about social movements of all kinds. They are recruiting people They are training groups sometimes, certainly funding them, and making sure that then they are taking action. And in order to do that, you have to frame the story in a way that people would look at whoever is on the other side, and instead of seeing just fellow citizens, they will see an enemy. And they will see somebody who is deserved to be acted upon using violence. And so you have to build that narrative. And you can use this tactic of othering, of building the us versus them. If you are us, if you're on my side, you're the good, everybody there is evil. And because they're evil, we can do to them whatever we want. Increased brutality, if you think about a terror group such as ISIS, where they have escalated their brutality again and again and again, on the one hand, that might push some people away from them and their cause and listening to them. But in terms of their recruitments and their organization efforts, that is a way to synthesize their followers to more mundane forms of violence and say, okay, maybe beheading is too much, but we can still shoot people in the street, and that would be considered acceptable. And so there is a reason, we have to understand that a lot of times when we see the action of organized political violence, we tend to think of it as irrational. They're crazy, that's why they're using violence, right? But the more you study it, the more you find out that there is a lot of thought behind everything and every tactic that is being utilized. You can see that in their use, very intentional use of social media. And of course, any organized violent political movement or a terror group or any other would have to compete in a way with what the state has to offer, because the state will continue and try to press on recruits and try to lure them back into the formal channels. And the organized violent group will have to try and compete with that and sell a different narrative to keep people interested and engaged in the violence. Now, I want to say a couple of words about two groups here, women and children. Let's start with women. Traditionally, we have been thinking about political violence as the realm for men, but we know that that's not true. We know that there are a lot of women that are involved in different ways in movements and organizations of political violence. First of all, we need to see the involvement in political violence, and especially organized ones, as a way for women to move from the domestic into the public. So a female in a country that engages in a civil war that wants to make a change and an impact might find herself attracted to one of the warring parties and become an actual active operator in order to become part of this public functions and away from just the domestic, the household. And it's also a way for some women to get out of tough domestic situations. For the groups themselves, if they recruit women and have more women in their leadership or in their operatives ranks, they can claim that they are actually agents of social change, and in some context that they bring modernization and this recognition of women as an equal part of the society. And the roles that we see women fulfill in political violence range from being there to motivate the men, either in a way of they want to be next to those females, or in the way that, well, if females are involved, then men should be involved as well. They also sometimes take on the traditional caretaker functions. In ISIS, a lot of times, you saw them recruit women who want to become part of this new utopian society and raise the next generation for that cause, or be there to make the meals for the men who fight on the field. So sometimes we do see women in more of a feminine traditional role, but serving the cause of the political movement. And then finally, we see those organizations intentionally deploying women when the enemy doesn't expect a female to be in that situation. So sending a woman into the gate of an army barricade where you know that they won't shoot her until she comes very close and they will talk to her. If she's carrying a bomb, at that point she can cause damage. So this is kind of a sneaky way to use females in the political violence movement. And some of those things are true about children, although in children, a lot of our discussion focuses on child soldiers. And here, from the point of view of the West, we tend to criticize that a lot, but we have to remember that childhood means different things in different places. And some children grow up in a war zone, and your choice is to either be a victim or take action, right? Especially in the teenager years, even early teenager years, kids might decide to take action, and that will take them out of that situation. Not to mention that in some situations, those violent groups come into the household and promise that the kids will be fed and get healthcare and things that their parents cannot provide them if they just come and become operative of the movement. And we do know that children that grow with violence have a very different idea about what violence is and what is legitimate and what is not legitimate than kids who grow up in the more sheltered communities. So this has been a few words and a few points about political violence. And in week number 12, you have a lot more context and information to supplement what I just talked about. And of course, we'll talk about it more at the Zoom meetings of this week.